All right, Chris. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for sitting down to do the podcast with us. I've been wanting to do this since we started shooting the podcast last year. And this is the first chance. We both have busy schedules to get you up here in Portland when we're both together. And I was thinking about it a couple days ago, and I realized I think we've been training together for almost 25 years when I first met you, which I think was one trip to California. I think Burton Richardson introduced me to you, correct?
Yes.
And it was the trip before the tournament or at the trip of the tournament? I don't remember.
I think it was before, but I don't.
I think one trip before, and then I came up the second time, and I competed as a blue belt in Hickson's tournament. You were competing. You had a match with Kleber Luciano.
I'd been at your school one time when that match.
I'd
already been.
Which was ended in a tie.
Yeah.
Although you did get a sweep. Technically.
No, I did. I never got the sweep, and he scored out of bounds.
Did he? Okay.
I think so.
Okay. Well, that was a long time ago. Good competitor. And since that time, which was, I think that was early '96, that tournament. So 22 years ago. Since that time, I've been training with you, and I was thinking about how you teach, and you teach differently than I teach, and you teach differently also than the way I've seen many Brazilian jiu-jitsu instructors teach. So you don't teach a lot of techniques, usually, especially not in the last couple of years, the way a lot of Brazilian jiu-jitsu instructors do. But you also don't teach the same way I do. You have your own, I think, fairly unique way of teaching. And I was trying to think about how I would describe that so that I could ask you better questions about it. And in thinking about it, I realized that even when I was a blue belt, to this day, the focus when you teach seems to be more about strategy and tactics and mindset than it ever is about techniques or posture or pressure. And I'm curious as to why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm sure part of it is, and I think more than you, oftentimes, especially in the past, I teach for me rather than the group in the past. But at the same time, I'm teaching for them, so it's not mutually exclusive. And part of what I do when I teach is to reinforce for myself what is important. I'm almost going outside of myself and I'm saying, what would I teach myself right now in this moment? And then at the same time, I kind of have always assessed the crowd by feel and by their intent and mood, and usually I can gauge what they mostly want out of that. And maybe if you want more out of that, you're going to have to dig. Just like in this interview.
Right.
If you want more out of it, you got to dig on me explaining this.
Well, that brings us to the second part of that, because the last couple of years there, I have noticed a change in your teaching in that it is more organized in a sense, and I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like that might be Hickson's influence of you working with him, because it reminds me of a sequence of principles.
Yeah.
But still, you talked about, for example, on Saturday when you were teaching, how you like to almost obfuscate the material you're teaching, and if you show a technique or a principle from jiu-jitsu, you want to immediately follow it up by the word you used was distract everyone. And I'm curious as to why that is.
I'm not even going to answer that.
Okay.
I'm going to leave you hanging on that intentionally.
Well, the optimistic take on that, the generous take on that would be you are forcing the students in the seminar to have to dig through what you're teaching to kind of find the gold. And that process you think is worthwhile. The pessimistic version of that, the uncharitable version of that, is that you don't really want to teach people to be good at jiu-jitsu because you're kind of hiding it a little bit, which is very old school.
That's very old school.
Yeah,
yes,
and I would obviously err on the side of the charitable version of that, but you tell me.
Well, I mean, I definitely don't want to hide with jiu-jitsu, and as you remember, we've spoken about often privately back in those early days when I first came up here.
Yeah.
I was showing stuff, and I almost felt like I had to look over my shoulder because was I even authorized to? It was.
People who weren't around that don't realize the control they had over jiu-jitsu at that time.
People, who weren't around in the olden days don't really realize that. It's like I always use the example. When I was a purple belt before UFC 1, on a very selfish level, I felt like I was running around with an AR and the other guys had muskets.
You pretty much were.
And do I want to give them an AR?
Right.
And that kind of was the larger Gracie family mindset.
Right.
It's you join us, you get the AR. Don't come here to learn how to beat us. And I don't know how much of that sense that I've retained. I don't think I have that much, but I'm like, when I came up here, I was showing you guys everything I fucking knew.
For sure.
And I was hungry to actually show it as well. And I developed and learned from showing things that sometimes I felt I could teach better even though I couldn't perform it better back then as a new black belt, right? And then, I don't know. I mean, it's like I remember a period of time not that long ago, although if you're young, it would seem like a long time ago, but where, if you showed up at a school that was hosting you, and if you started with self-defense or a stand-up, they weren't interested.
Right.
They wanted to learn the Elahiva guard. They wanted to learn what was in the zeitgeist, in the current jiu-jitsu zeitgeist, especially as the speciation was happening between no-gi, sport gi without strikes. The various MMA rules were working themselves out. And for a long while, I would only in my head formulate what is that balance between all of these things now evolving in their own directions, but based upon the man-made rules of the game, which leads me as a amateur evolutionary / anthropologist, biologist, amateur, is let's analyze why they speciate. And most of the time, well, all the time, it's environment.
Right.
Because environmental pressures. And environment is always stronger than will. Until you're aware of it. Then you have enough to observe it in a sense that you can gain advantages from all of it. From each of those environments. I don't know. I'm not being all that clear. and not by intention. I'm actually just trying to word this out. And I've always liked rules of three. And I like them in a very non-logical way. But at the same time, there is some logic in it.
Sure.
There's the base is three. There's street art and sport.
Right.
There's strikes, clinch, ground.
Right.
I've found most of the time, there's three foundational chokes in the guard. There's three basic sweeps. There's three, sometimes there's two, sometimes there's four, and it might screw up my thing because I want to cram it into three.
Right.
But, so what I have done is in order to, I think all of us as we've aged as black belts, and Hickson has been indeed a big influence in this, is how do I simplify the complex?
Right.
And part of what I do is show the chaos so you can find where it's simple. Mm-hmm. And then, as soon as you think it's simple, I want to throw chaos in there. Because reality is chaos, in essence. It's like order and chaos, the battle, right?
You're the guy in pottery class that always puts the kiln bomb in.
No, I'm the guy who wants the kiln bomb in.
Okay. But you don't do it yourself.
But I'm not going to do it.
Yeah. All right.
But I might suggest what would happen if a kiln bomb went in there, knowing somebody else will take that and do it. A saboteur. No, I don't. No, I didn't even explain that well. And in this podcast, if you're hearing this, take it for whatever you want, right?
I think it makes sense.
Because I don't even,
So, people who know you, which is probably everybody that's watching this podcast or know about you, know you're one of the first Americans to start jiu-jitsu. You just alluded to it a few minutes ago where you said you were a purple belt, which is decent, good at jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, advanced amateur status.
Before the UFC even started.
Yeah.
And
I would have probably won it.
Oh, for sure. No doubt about it.
Well, I mean, had I got hit by the musket, I would have lost, right?
But if you'd taken it to the ground, you would have easily
won.
But it puts you in a very unique position where you saw the evolution of jiu-jitsu from the old school days till now, and you're one of the few people, one of the few Americans who knows that whole story and who's followed it very closely. You're also in the heart of American jiu-jitsu in Southern California. You're apolitical in the sense that you've always had your garage, which you've had ever since I've known you, which is a kind of a mecca for all kinds of affiliations to come train with you. So you're always getting all the different influences from the different schools. So you're in a really unique position to answer a couple questions that almost no other American could answer, or even Brazilian for that matter. And the first one would be, describe what it was like when you first started in the garage and you trained, was it Hickson or Hoist was your first instructor?
Hoist was my very first instructor.
Okay, and then you worked with Hickson.
I worked with Hickson
and then you went with Higgin when it branched off.
Yes.
What was the jiu-jitsu like then as compared to what the jiu-jitsu is like now?
There was at that time, and I remember being loosely aware that there was, the argument was about amongst the movers and shakers of this thing, back when black belts had no red swath, when they hung down 2 feet past.
Judo gis.
Judo gis had shorter, loopier, baggier sleeves. Mm-hmm. The Gracie, the jiu-jitsu gi, had a thinner collar and was canvas, not a pearl weave or any of these things. And just like in the NFL, the pressure in the ball can really matter.
Right.
All that was being still worked out.
Right.
And I remember overhearing in a Portuguese, loosely understanding certain debates and arguments. Whether one should be willing to open a guard, or should you always make your opponent earn the opening, have to open it? Should you be looking back to close your guard if it's open, or go ahead and embrace the openness and explore in a new game? And most of it was based upon whether it would work in a real fight,
right,
where you're being punched and headbutted.
Headbutts, yeah.
And I watched that drift into several directions.
Okay.
And there was a time where one could say that old school guys either clung to the original, it's almost like the Constitution, original intent or spirit of the law.
Right.
And I've always leaned into the spirit of the law without changing the law, right? It's what was the question again? Because we got it.
Old school jiu-jitsu, so you've already answered it to a degree. You're slipping back in. People may not realize that when you and I hang out, we never talk about jiu-jitsu. We inevitably talk about geopolitics.
That's right,
So
because it's far more interesting.
Yeah, but if we're talking about jiu-jitsu, and you alluded to it, even the open guard was new.
The open guard at one time was new.
Right.
Women wearing pants was one time a very liberal idea.
Right. And from the guard opening then came what? De La Hiva?
Yes, and
Because guys were passing standing, right?
correct.
Yeah.
And a really interesting time I remember was when the gis changed and went from these almost, you remember this, these ultra thick collar,
Yeah.
Armani suit, tight sleeve.
Yeah.
The pants were so tight you couldn't even grab them anymore.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it like to me, I remember that I found those offensive because in essence you're cheating the game.
Yeah.
Because if this ultimately boils down to how do I defeat my opponent who's attacking me in the street, the hypothetical real fight, and I become so reliant on the equipment, I'm losing the essence and the core spirit of the game.
Right.
And so a lot of the old school guys, especially Hickson, always has kept the original intent. And what I love about Hickson and Jean-Jacques Machado is when they adapt their jiu-jitsu, they're adapting to the new school with not necessarily joining the new school. They're adapting to the new school. It's like I remember when the pressure game came about. And
Pressure passing?
pressure everything, pressure side controls,
That wasn't there?
pressure passing. It was there, but it wasn't canonized in essence.
Was that more Hickson?
A lot of it was Higan Machado.
Okay.
Because it's almost like the jiu-jitsu alone didn't have it, wrestling alone didn't have it, judo alone didn't have it. But when you merged them, you got it. And it was this, and not even a merge, it was almost like you took elements of wrestling, judo, Greco, and by taking those elements and applying the jiu-jitsu principles, out comes pressure.
It almost goes back to holds, right?
Yes. And Bob Anderson and the Greco hips. And I've heard, and it's just pure hearsay, I have heard through people I find reputable that there was some of the people rejected the Bob Anderson aspects of Greco, and others adopted it. And, you know, usually in any interview, when it comes down to sifting through the history as it occurred in the 60s through 90s in Brazil, I decline to answer because I have so little firsthand knowledge.
Sure, you would have picked it up in the States.
Yes, but what I got was a feeling of how there were shifts and how there was a conflict in the way things were being taught by this group versus that group.
Right.
And when the sport was about, there was elements that never wanted it to become a sport. There were elements that thought it could become a sport and somehow retain what others argued would be lost if it became a sport.
Right.
And because of how I am a journalist, scientist, I try to look at it and watch it all with an attempt to not judge it.
Yeah, you're trying to be objective.
Trying to be as objective as I possibly can.
So I'm asking
and
you,
I'm a student.
Yeah,
right?
I'm not asking you to apply a
yeah.
value judgment to it, but just the differences. When you rolled in the garage, how was that different from maybe now? Because I could see even differences from how we used to train. Obviously, when you first came to Oregon,
yes.
20 years ago, how we train now is very different.
Very different. Yeah. Back then, it was as you remember all but too well as well, it really was martial art against martial art.
Right.
Right? There was that overlay. And there was the challenge matches. And there was the Jeet Kune Do world, which mostly thought that they were integrating all of the arts. But really, mostly they were picking up what you so accurately but described as turning aliveness into a dead pattern.
Right.
And the combat sports, wrestling, boxing, judo, now sport jiu-jitsu, are better foundational core systems, but are still constrained within the box of the sport, right? What I found was the best way that I could cerebrally balance it as both a martial artist for me and as an instructor is to definitely, while I teach, explain street art and sport. And I think of it as an artist in colors. Let's call red is street, blue is sport, and white or black is art. You could clearly see that that one's blue, that one's white, that one's red. When you mix them, you get a weird purple. And that purple, you lose the truth in it. You can't see the red or the blue or the black or the white. So we have to pull them apart and go, here is the street aspect of this. Here's the, you and this guy are thrown in a pit, one guy leaves alive. Here's the sport, and here's the art. that ever elusive duality of black and white with gray.
Right.
And when I find it, and I'm saying this purely as a metaphor analogy, the black and white art, when it's just black and white, is fucking awesome.
Yeah.
Black, white, and shades of gray art is its own thing, right? And then you throw in color, and the black looks too black, and the white looks too bright. So we dim down those blacks, and we dim down the whites, and it looks like real life. And that's the distraction, is all of this stuff all together. So if we pull it apart and show you this, this, and this, what I try to do is not let you go, oh, that's truth. Because then you miss the other picture.
Got it.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
And part of that is purely psychobabble. And I'm aware that part of that is pure psychobabble. Psychobabble intended to go, oh, that's psychobabble.
Right. Well, do you think anything's been lost since those days?
Yes and no.
Okay. What's been lost?
I'm not even going to answer that.
Okay.
Because I'll just be chattering to hear myself.
Okay.
What's been found?
You tell me.
We find what's rare. We value what's rare.
Right.
And I believe that the quote-unquote magic behind jiu-jitsu is simple and rare.
100%.
And that's all I'm going to say.
100%. Okay.